36 years later, Star Trek surprisingly calls out Joe Piscopo's comic on TNG. In 1989, Star Trek The Next Generation aired an episode called The Outrageous Okona, a mostly forgettable story by most measures, except for one subplot that has lingered in fandom lore for decades. Data's attempt to understand human humor by learning stand-up comedy from a character played by none other than 1980's Saturday Night Live star Joe Piscopo. That subplot, wedged awkwardly into an already weak episode, has been mocked, memed, and misunderstood ever since. And now, 36 years later, Star Trek has done the unthinkable. It finally called it out. In a recent episode of Star Trek, Lower Decks Season 5, which continues to thrive as the franchise's most meta and self-aware installment, a single line of dialogue casually name-drops Piscopo's comic hologram in a way that not only acknowledges the infamous TNG scene, but gently pokes fun at it. It's blink and you'll miss it material, a classic Lower Decks move. But for fans who have long cringed at Data's foray into comedy, it's a hilarious and unexpected moment of vindication. This moment isn't just a gag. It's Star Trek finally reckoning with one of its most bizarre footnotes. The legacy of Joe Piscopo in Star Trek. To understand why this matters, we need to rewind to TNG Season 2. The Outrageous Okona was supposed to be a lighthearted romp, focused on a Han Solo-esque rogue charming the crew while being caught in a Romeo and Juliet-style misunderstanding. But somewhere along the way, the writers decided that Data, always curious about humanity, should use his downtime to learn about laughter. Enter the holodeck and Joe Piscopo, playing an unnamed 20th century comedian. Data seeks advice on how to tell jokes, with Piscopo's hologram guiding him through a series of groan-worthy one-liners and impressions, including a very dated Jerry Lewis impression that went on way too long. The scene, filled with exaggerated gestures and flat delivery, was meant to be funny. But it wasn't. Even Brent Spiner, as always giving it his all, couldn't save the awkward pacing and painful jokes. Joe Piscopo's presence was intended to be a fun cameo. After all, he was a recognizable face from SNL, and his inclusion seemed to signal that TNG was trying to lighten up in its second season. Unfortunately, the segment quickly became infamous for all the wrong reasons. Fans and critics alike panned the bit. It felt out of place, clashed tonally with the rest of the episode, and worst of all, it completely misunderstood what made Data compelling. Watching the android deadpan his way through poorly constructed gags wasn't just unfunny, it was almost tragic. And in hindsight, it embodied the worst tendencies of TNG's early growing pains: disjointed plots, odd pacing, and tone-deaf humor. Yet despite the widespread ridicule, Piscopo's comic endured in the cultural memory of Trek fans, like a joke that wasn't funny the first time, but somehow became legendary through repetition. Lower Decks brings it full circle. Flash forward to 2025. In Lower Decks Season 5, Episode 3, Ensign Boimler is forced into a mandatory holodeck improv class as part of a Starfleet personal development program. Annoyed and confused, he mutters under his breath, "What is this, some kind of Joe Piscopo situation?" It's a throwaway line, delivered while he awkwardly climbs onto a holodeck stage surrounded by holographic audience members programmed to laugh no matter what. The line isn't lingered on. No cutaway, no flashback. But for TNG fans with long memories, it lands like a photon torpedo. In that moment, Star Trek, a franchise that often takes itself incredibly seriously, openly acknowledges one of its strangest comedic misfires. And not just that, it puts that moment into continuity. The implication is clear. Within the universe of Star Trek, Joe Piscopo's comic routine on the holodeck has become legendary. In all the wrong ways. It's a moment of catharsis, really. For decades, fans have joked about how bad that subplot was. Now, the show is in on the joke. Why the callback works. What makes this callback so effective isn't just that it's funny. It's that it respects the fanbase's intelligence. Lower Decks has always specialized in self-aware humor, references, and deep-cut Easter eggs, but it rarely feels mean-spirited. The writers clearly love Trek, warts and all. And that includes acknowledging the times the franchise stumbled. Calling out Joe Piscopo's TNG cameo works because it's not trying to erase the past or pretend it didn't happen. It embraces the cringe, celebrates the awkwardness, and recontextualizes it as part of Trek's rich, strange history. It also does what good comedy does: punches up. Piscopo was never the problem, the concept was. And Lower Decks gently teases the scene without blaming the actors who tried their best with bad material. There's also something poetic about Boimler, arguably the show's most data-like character in terms of neurosis and awkward ambition, being the one to invoke that memory. It's a subtle way of saying that every generation of Starfleet officers has their own ridiculous holodeck experiences. And some of them become cautionary tales. From cringe to canon, there's a growing trend in modern Star Trek, especially with Lower Decks and Strange New Worlds, of reclaiming odd or flawed bits of canon and reframing them. Whether it's giving Nyota Uhura richer emotional arcs, turning the Gorn into credible threats, or making Enterprise references cool again, these series don't ignore the past. They integrate it. Joe Piscopo's comic wasn't exactly crying out for redemption, but the callback gives fans a kind of closure. It says, yes, that happened. Yes, it was weird. And yes, we're still laughing, just not for the reasons the writers intended. And that's actually quite fitting, because that's what Star Trek does. It evolves, it adapts, and it learns from its mistakes. Just like Data. The enduring mystery of the hologram comic. One could even argue that the hologram comic's mysterious identity adds to the absurdity of it all. He's never given a name. He has no backstory. He just is a holographic manifestation of late 20th century humor as envisioned by someone in the 24th century. There's something inherently surreal about that, especially in a franchise that has spent decades meticulously world-building its science and ethics. Maybe that's why the callback works. The Piscopo hologram represents the franchise's brief and gloriously awkward flirtation with 1980s pop culture in a way that dates it more than any uniform or matte painting ever could. And yet, by calling it out now, Star Trek demonstrates a rare kind of self-awareness. The punchline that took 36 years. So, what's the verdict? Did Lower Decks redeem Joe Piscopo's infamous comic hologram? Not exactly. But it did something more impressive. It made that moment funny again, intentionally this time. The best comedy often comes from looking back at our mistakes and laughing, not out of ridicule, but out of recognition. That holodeck scene in The Outrageous Okona was never about the jokes themselves. It was about Data trying to connect, trying to understand laughter. In a way, that episode was prophetic because 36 years later, we're still laughing. And finally, the franchise is laughing with us. That single joke in Lower Decks works as a quiet acknowledgement of fandom's long memory, a wink to the camera, and a reminder that even the most awkward moments can eventually pay off. After all, in Star Trek, no moment is truly forgotten, only reinterpreted. And in the end, that's the most Star Trek punchline of all. Connect, trying to understand laughter. In a way, that episode was prophetic because 36 years later, we're still laughing. And finally, the franchise is laughing with us. The joke in Lower Decks works as a quiet acknowledgement of